to help develop that business, which was based on a business I had when I was living in Boston. I primarily did wedding cakes, but I wanted to sort of reformat it, incorporating local grains and especially more whole grains into my baked goods. So I have been renting kitchen space in East Liberty at the East End Cooperative Ministry and selling at a few farmers markets. I did the Bloomfield Winter Market last winter, and then I just did the downtown Market Square Farmers Market, and might be taking a break from farmers markets. I can tell you a little about my background. I've been baking for over 20 years. After culinary school, I worked in a bunch of different bakeries, doing primarily breads, actually, until I made my way into learning how to do cakes. And then I worked in restaurants as a pastry chef, and then I worked at Cooks Illustrated magazine for about 5 years, and I still do freelance for Chris Kimball. It's unbelievable. Like, yeah, so, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. Cool. Oliver?
Hi, so my name is Oliver Pinder, and I am the owner of Wild Rise Bakery. Everything that we do is entirely gluten-free, and we do everything from bread to pastries, cakes, pies, you name it. I started the business at the end of 2019, part-time, and then the pandemic hit, and I was no longer employed at the catering company I was working at, and decided to do it full-time and have been doing it full-time since. And we sell at Bloomfield Market and the East End Food Co-op and a couple other places. Most of what we do outside of retail sales at the market and whatnot is wholesale to different restaurants and cafes. And when I started, initially I was using a lot more of the local folks like Weatherbury and whatnot, but because of the stipulations I have around cross-contamination, which is one of the things I'm sure we'll talk about, we do still use some things, but there are some things I no longer can use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Makes sense. Thanks, Oliver. Chloe?
Hi, I'm Chloe Newman. The name of my business is Crustworthy, and it's a sourdough bread business as well as baked goods business. I sell locally as well to the Bloomfield Market. That's my primary source of sales right now. I've had the business for about 4 years. Started it just as a one-woman bakery, and it's still pretty much that, although I definitely have a lot of help and support at the markets. I try to source my ingredients as locally as possible, as responsibly as possible. That's really important to my business and my involvement with it. I really try to promote grain diversity among the kinds of breads that I make. So, I get a lot of people who come up to the stand and say, hey, do you have any sourdough? Just sourdough. And I'm like, yeah, well, everything is sourdough that I make here. But, I have your classic white sourdough loaf that you might expect, but we also have, for example, today's menu is multigrain that has whole buckwheat and rye. We had a 50% whole wheat. We had a seeded loaf, and just all kinds of different things that people wouldn't normally expect from a sourdough bread, let alone, most market stands. So, that's been what I've been up to. Also, I don't have a storefront. I work out of a bakery space that I've converted from my home garage. And it's fully licensed. It's a little crazy, but it does work, and it's very sanitary, I promise. So that has been, my primary production space, and I'm just sort of planning what the next steps will look like.
Thank you. So my first question is, what's your process for developing a recipe? When you have an idea for something, where do you start?
Do you want us to go in order?
Yeah, and it's whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll go first. So I think I use a lot of recipes that I actually took away from one of the bakeries where I really learned like a lot of my cake recipes. And then also I use a lot of the recipes that I've developed for the magazines just because I'm familiar with them, and then I will adapt them, or when obviously have to scale up a lot. And then I kind of make tweaks, and I do a lot of substitutions. But I rarely will, I start from scratch. I usually base it on something that's already out there.
What are your substitutions usually based off of?
Well, so I try to put in some whole grains. So for example, chocolate chip cookie, I use like about a third rye flour instead of the all-purpose flour. I'm trying to think, like I have some muffin recipes and I'll throw like some buckwheat flour in, and I use some whole wheat pastry flour in my sticky buns. So it just sort of seeing how much I can add to that, and and then other things like, I don't know, like if it's a seasonal fruit or something that's going in there, those kind of substitutions. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. Do you want to?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, we don't have to go to row.
Like,
We don't conform to that.
No.
That all sounds pretty on point, I think, as far as how I would also go about like developing a new recipe. Yeah, I take a lot of the things that I already make, like a base cookie dough, and maybe substitute in some whole grain flour and think about like, okay, how is this going to affect the texture? Does that affect what kinds of like, how much liquid I need to put in or something like that. But everything tends to be pretty small, and oftentimes you can kind of intuit, as you're making the recipe, like, oh, this doesn't feel like it should, so I think I should add more of this or take some of this out next time. But yeah, a lot of it is also just, if I see a flavor combination that I really want to try out, that's always really inspiring, like doing different kinds of like fruity, herby things, or but I think I also, nowadays especially, I feel like I've gotten sort of in a groove, and my focus is less on new products and more on, what are the next steps for my business as a whole. So a lot of the products that I do are sort of like recycling different ideas or flavor combinations. But every once in a while, I do see something that I'm like, wow, I really want to try making that one thing. I don't want to put it out on the table at the farmer's market until I really get it where it needs to be. I think in the beginning I was a lot more relaxed about that. I would just make things and say like, I don't know what this is, but you can try it, you can buy it. And then people will come back the next week and be like, oh, where's that thing you made? I'll be like, oh, I didn't know anyone would actually like that. Or, well, it's different this week. And sometimes that works, I do change out a lot of flavors week to week. And so sometimes people say like, well, last week you had this. And you have to kind of balance that by having some things that are there every week and others that, will bring people back to try something else.
Yeah, I've definitely learned that too.
Yeah.
The hard way. I'll just like, I'll make whatever I have. Like, I got frozen bananas. Yeah. And then they're like, where's that thing? You're like, oh.
Yeah. You get like a cult following of one thing, like your buckwheat cookies. Like if you ever took those away, like.
Oh, I know, it'd be terrible.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's funny that you say that, because I was thinking about that this morning. I was remembering something I did last fall, and I was like, oh, I wonder if I'd ever do that again. It's so random that I never did it again.
Yeah. Sometimes customers will remind you. They'll be like, do you remember that one time you made this? You're like, yeah.
I know. And I was like, what's the chance? Yeah. I guess for me, it's a little bit, not to say that anything is harder than anyone else's, but I feel like with gluten-free baking, it's just so much research all the time.
It's definitely harder.
And it's just like, I think I'm always reading. One of the things that I was very fortunate to do when I started my business was I started researching all the different grains, because the part of why I started Wild Rise was because it was very difficult to find gluten-free bread that wasn't primarily white rice, potato starch, tapioca starch, and cornstarch, or some blend of that. And I hope it's all right to say that I have IBS, and so some of the things that I struggle with is high sugar, high starch, and I was like, oh, all of these folks who are dealing with these challenges are looking for things that they can eat and also want to eat well. I want to eat well. And I fell in love with sourdough. And I was like, I want to make gluten-free sourdough bread. And that's kind of how the business got its name, because when I started, all of the bread that I was doing was sourdough with Wild Rise fermented. It was usually also buckwheat, either from Frankfurt or Weatherbury, because I didn't have any challenges with that because I'm not celiac. And so for me, for a lot of recipe development, now that I have sort of like a staple basis for a lot of the breads that I do, sometimes it's a lot of tweaking. So, we do have sort of it's we'll consider it a treasure trove in the bottom of the freezer. That's just things that we've tried that didn't work out.
Oh, yeah. The Ziploc bag.
Oh
Just
yeah,
keep adding
I
to
know.
it, yeah.
It's like I'll
Like
use that.
graveyard.
But yeah, I consider I'm trying to like repurpose the term and not make it sort of like somewhere things go to die
Yeah.
because
That
you
makes
know
sense.
like
Yep.
like right now never mind. I'm not even gonna go down that road. But I was just gonna say, you know, a lot of it is trial and error. But it's also really, I've come a long way because I've been doing it every day for the last couple of years. There are things like Chloe was saying that you get a feel for, and you're like, oh, I know what this is supposed to feel like. This doesn't feel like that. But I know that I can add this and it will have this result, you know? And one of the things that I really enjoy is, apart from playing with seasonal flavors, is like, I tend to spend a lot of time just like laying in bed at night thinking about things that I want to eat. And that's kind of how I make anything for my business. I'm like, oh, you know, it'd be great if I did this and this together. That'd be awesome. And then I kind of like run it through sort of like my mental process. And would my mom approve of this? Which sounds silly,
That's a good
but you know, like
Yeah.
having Caribbean family, I feel like is one of the hardest benchmarks for measuring anything tasting good. It's just a lot more criticism, you know. No,
I worked for another baker, and she said that would be her question. She would be somebody like, "Was this okay?" Somebody working for her, and she would say, "Would you serve it to your mother?"
I know, right?
That's good.
So yeah, more or
Yeah.
less.
When you're thinking of recipes to try or new recipes to develop, is it that it comes from, okay, I have this recipe I want to try, or is it there's a regional grain that I haven't worked with or that I would like to work with? How often do you start with either one of those?
It's a mix for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it is, you know, like working with a grain, and oftentimes I'll throw it into bread initially, you know, just like a sort of standard white loaf, and then I'll like throw in maybe like 25% of a grain and see what happens. Because usually, if I'm working with something new that I haven't worked with before, if I try to go 100%, you know, this happened a lot when I started working with ancient grains in particular. It would just be like wholly unlike anything I'd known. I'd just be like, I don't know what to do with this, and I don't know if this is right. And you know, you'd get some really crazy flavors, but it didn't really give you much of a starting place. So yeah, I think often I'll try a grain, you know, against like white flour in a loaf, and then I might take from there like, okay, this reminds me of like this. You know, maybe it would be really interesting to try this in in like, you know, paired with chocolate in something, or starting to kind of make those flavor pairings. I have one of my favorite little like bookshelf cookbooks that I have is the Flavor Bible, or excuse me, the Flavor, oh my God, I got the name wrong, the Flavor Thesaurus. Sorry, but it has just like this wheel of flavors that, you know, the book has this really crazy way of organizing and pairing them. It's sort of like a choose your own adventure, like you're flipping back and forth. But I often think to think like, what would be my flavor thesaurus for like what this grain is? Yeah, I think it's usually sort of like having that taste test first for me, and then thinking about like, where could I incorporate this? You know, what would highlight this and make it special?
I like that method. I think like pairing it with a white bread and seeing what the flavors are and seeing how it cooperates, how it acts. It's like a good first step.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's similar, like thought process. I think I do focus a lot more on like think about the flavor first, but then I also think about how it affects the texture. So like I like using the buckwheat in my galette dough because it, you know, doesn't have any gluten in it, and so then it makes it really easy to work with, and it adds a wonderful flavor to it. Yeah, like, and I tend to pair rye with chocolate, you know, so. But yeah, I think a lot about, like, I like spelt because I like it in my biscuits, and I just like what it does to the biscuit. So yeah, thinking about texture
And where those regional or whole grains might fit.
right, in which
Yeah.
recipe they might fit
Yeah.
in best, like
Yeah.
a puzzle. Yeah.
So I feel like I come to it very often from what is what would I like to eat that I cannot find gluten-free? And, like we do a brioche, and it's definitely not gonna be like gluten-full brioche in all of the ways. But, people are always like, you do a what? Gluten-free? And what I like is I'm always using assorted whole grains just by the nature of what we make. So we're always using sorghum, we're always using buckwheat, we're always using brown rice, oat flours. So, I think for me it's more of like, oh, how can I use a different blend of these things. And like you, I also just love buckwheat so much. I love to put it in everything. And we used to do like a buckwheat pastry that was purely for savory. But when you scale up, it becomes harder to have like buckwheat pastry and not buckwheat pastry and like have all of these different things. But there are some things that I absolutely will not avoid using buckwheat in. So like our brownies are always going to be buckwheat brownies, and like we have this really lovely vegan chocolate cake that's buckwheat.
Oh,
and
cool.
and it's just like that
very cool.
nuttiness is just so crazy, So I think for me, it's very much like I start off with like, well, I would like to eat this, and this is not available to me. But then getting really into flavor pairings as well. So, yeah.
We're doing a lot of name dropping of grains. Grain dropping?
Grain.
Oh, yeah.
Green name drop.
To build off of what you're saying, Oliver, about scale, I'm wondering, when you guys are all talking about this process of how you recipe develop and thinking about the grains and maybe thinking about the grains first, right, and then developing a recipe second, how much of that do you think is possible because of your scale? Or, and do you feel like that is something you could do as you grow? Or is that something that is like unique to your size? Does that make sense?
Are you saying because of how the scale of our recipes?
Like if you, is that something that you see as scalable, kind of going backwards, grain first in the recipe development? Like for, a bakery that's maybe 4 or 5 times your size, is that something that you think they could do, or is it unique to the smaller?
I mean, it's certainly more cost effective, right? To be testing, I'm always testing the smallest amounts possible, right? Because you don't want to waste it. I mean, that's a tough question because I've heard something like, oh, this recipe can't be scaled up, more than 3 times. And I'm like, well, why not? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Especially if you're converting to weights and liquid measures, which is the best way to do that, right? It's when you're starting to scale up, it's more accurate. But I don't know.
I think it's easier because one of the things that I've found is being able to scale up. I'm able to, in this, especially right now where things are so expensive, it's insane to buy flour and it's insane to buy gluten-free flour. But being able to buy in bulk, and because we're using these different grains, like I'm able to sort of like mess around with different ones more. And I know that, okay, cool, everything won't use oat flour. And I have, folks who have like oat sensitivities, but I know that because I have oat flour in the kitchen all the time and we're using it for these like 3 things, I can potentially test all of these other things and then extrapolate out from that. So I feel like it should be easier, but for, I don't know, like maybe the size, I feel like it would be harder if I was super small and I wanted to try all of these different things and then try to like then blow it up it might be harder. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, again, being pretty much the only person in my baking space. I did have help earlier this year, but it's really hard for me to motivate myself to recipe test sometimes. I think I talked about that earlier, just like, you kind of get into your pattern. You're like, I know these things work. I'm just going to do what I know and try to kind of perfect those. While initially I felt a lot more adventurous about, creating new products, but I do have daydreams of just like having extra help in the kitchen where it's like, okay, you do the usual stuff. I'm going to go have fun and like try out these new products and
and then hopefully, and also just having someone else to chat with and have new ideas with. Like I tell people this all the time, like I'm so bored of my own ideas. So I'm really looking forward to just like expanding and working with other people to have that kind of collaboration in terms of like, what do you think this works well with? Like, do you think it needs more this or that, as opposed to just having that conversation in my head?
So what you're saying is we need to get on a group chat.
Yes.
Like, start talking about.
Well, because I'm trying to offer more like gluten-free stuff, right?
Cool,
I know,
yeah, and
Yeah.
But I will say, I totally hear what you're saying too. Yeah, and it's the more busy you get and the more tired you get, you're just like, I give myself like 3 shots. If I can't get something where I want it in 3 times, I'm like, forget, shelve it, go back to it later. Like I've been trying to work on brioche, and it's so embarrassing. Like I cannot get a recipe that I'm happy with, and so I'm like, it makes me so angry because I want a good brioche. I just want to sell a good loaf of brioche, but I'm like, I don't have the time that I want to put into it to make it the way I want it.
if it makes you feel better, I like literally this week just changed the entire brioche recipe that I did.
But I understand that totally.
Yeah,
You're
and I'm
like,
just
no, it's just not right.
I had one person be like, oh, it's all right, but it's so cakey, and I was like. I was like, you know what? Maybe it could have less sugar. I was like, scrap it. And
Does that get to you when like you have that one, like everyone else like loves the product and then there's one customer who's like, I don't know, what's my favorite? And you're like, I need to change it entirely.
For this one person.
Yeah.
I know. But it in terms of getting to you, I totally hear that. But it makes me like look at my stuff really critically, which I already do. But then it's like, oh, can this be better in some ways? And sometimes I'm like, this person just needs to see.
Not baking, like, are you pleasing yourself? So
Right.
I have that problem. So I'm like, do I like it?
Right.
What I like is probably not what most people. I don't like sweet things, right? So I tend to make my things almost not sweet enough.
yeah.
It's like really towing the line, and
Yeah.
I have to kind of keep that in mind. Going like, people buy sweets because they want sweets.
This
Yeah.
is true.
That's-
Salt is my
Yeah,
challenge.
it's
I'm
like-
not high salt.
Oh, I'm so
and
high
so
salt.
I have people. Everybody is like, oh, I'll taste this, and I like,
Yeah.
So.
I have a question about, I guess, and maybe like this is more, well, it's not just for Erica, but because you've baked also not in Western Pennsylvania, but I guess like I've been learning more about how like regional food gets distributed here, and that there is like a pretty big like unfilled space of like there's not really like a wholesale distributor that's focused on regional and local food, because there like were ones, but they've like closed, and now there seems to be like this missing link between like producers and bakers like yourselves. So is that something that you like think about or like affects your business? Do you feel like you've had experience baking elsewhere where there have been like better ways for you to like get a hold of
Yeah, 100%.
grains?
But I totally like, yes, because I have struggled with this. Because I worked in Boston, and working through the restaurants, I knew all the people that supply, all the suppliers. So all I do is call them up and be like, oh, give me that ingredient that I want, or that, and, I had somebody come in and bring like the best hand-picked berries that were still warm, like in the restaurant. And so I definitely have not been able to find that here. I also haven't spent, I will say I haven't spent a lot of time looking, but I have not been able to connect with a single farmer. I will say also part of that is because I don't do enough volume to make it worth my while. But it's definitely been a fantasy of mine to be like, I want to hook up with like, and then I want to be like, I have these like apples that are like, I can't sell them, but I can bake with them. Let's make a deal kind of situation. But yeah, I'm definitely missing that connection for sure.
Where are your favorite like regional grain suppliers? Where do you source
Frankfurt Farms.
Frankfurt? Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Oh yeah, just seconded Frankfurt
Yeah.
like for almost entirely.
So you too, Oliver.
In
I
a
know that you
perfect
mentioned some
world, I would
challenges.
buy from Frankfurt.
Yeah.
But I can't because of the cross-contamination issue. When I was just baking for myself and much smaller scale, it was something that I could do. But now everything has to be like certified gluten-free, and so most of the grain that I buy comes from Bob's Red Mill. However you pronounce that.
Yeah.
Bob's Red Mill, and ideally, I would love to continue using Frankfurt's buckwheat. There was a brief time I was purchasing from a place out in Harmony, but it's really difficult to get out there and back. And one of the challenges that I've found with sourcing buckwheat is there are like different grades of buckwheat. There's like fancy and there's like super fancy and all of these like funny names. And it just like depends on, it just like describes how it's milled. So whether it's how fine it is, whether they remove the outer husk and all of that. And it's really important to me to keep that like whole grain on the buckwheat, all partially for the taste. And because my sourdough starter is gluten-free, and I've noticed that it tends to be its healthiest when I use buckwheat. It's definitely a buckwheat starter, and it works best when I have buckwheat that's the whole grain. Otherwise, it just kind of, it requires a lot more inputs, and I try to minimize the inputs in it because I just want it to be its joyful self, you know. But if I could find more of that, that would be definitely, yeah.
What other challenges come with not just sourcing, but like working with regional grains?
There have, for me, been some like variations, sometimes year to year or like even batch to batch that can be difficult to manage. You know, talking a little bit before about like being able to intuit how a recipe is supposed to feel is really great. And in a lot of the workshops that I teach with, you know, introduction to sourdough, and, you know, I'm always encouraging my students to just like get your hands in it so that you know what things feel like, because it's just so important, especially when you're working with local grains, I think. So those kinds of inconsistencies can be difficult for me. I noticed like the whole wheat that I was using, for example, also like as of a few months ago, I started noticing like more like whole like grain in it, and I wasn't sure what was going on there. So there's just like certain things that'll show up that maybe you wouldn't expect from something that's been, you know, really gone through the ringer to get like on the grocery store shelf. But generally though, like I would say the benefits of working with a small producer outweigh the challenges for me. I mean, there have been times where like emergency situation, like I need a 50-pound bag of rye by tonight, and like I've called the mill and asked them to mill it for me, and like drove out to Saxonburg to get it.
Wow.
Yeah, and like that's just amazing that that's a possibility. And you know, just communication in general, I think, is a lot more direct. And I don't know, I just trust it so much more. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had, I think, a few small issues with storage, because again, I don't use it in the quantities that like Chloe uses it. And I had some mold on me, like I think was it buckwheat or my rye? I was so sad though. And it was like in my fridge, and I didn't realize some moisture had kind of, you know, again, you're like renting kitchen space, but it's a whole nother thing. So now I keep everything like, you know, really well sealed in the freezer, and then I just take out little that I need. So I've learned that, you know, the hard way, because it is expensive.
Yeah.
I guess on the price side, I think especially in the last couple of years, sourcing has become a real challenge. You know, sometimes with the economy being what it is lately, it's just been really difficult. Sometimes things are there and then they're not. And sometimes you're like, okay, cool, I can't find rice flour. How can I not find brown rice flour? And you're like, okay, all right. And so then you have to like figure out where you're gonna source from differently. You know, there was a brief time we were working with wild purveyors to get like all of our brown rice flour, but then they stopped carrying it because of the challenges brought on by COVID and sourcing. And it's, you know, and they were sourcing regionally. I forget the name of the company. And so, you know, they're just like sometimes having to pivot with what you use and the producer you're sourcing from, the supplier you're sourcing from. So I think that's one of my challenges. And also like just the way prices have skyrocketed. You know, gluten-free grains are already abysmally expensive. And I've seen things like psyllium has jumped from like $140 for like a 25-pound bag to $208 for a 25-pound bag. And you know, you have prices just like all over the map right now with everything happening globally. So I feel like that's one of the things that are really tough.
How does that translate to your menu and your sales?
It depends on the thing. So like with psyllium, I can't do what I'm doing without psyllium, just because that's basically replacing gluten. And so for me, what that has meant is like, you know, I've had to find ways to not pass that entirely on to the customer because the price points are just like so high already. And, you know, I'm not trying to price out people who can't afford to buy the things. So, you know, some of the things that we've had to do is like we've had to adjust the sizes of the loaves that we've done. And, you know, folks have been really understandable, and also just finding a middle point where it's like, yeah, okay, I'm not gonna make as much on this thing, but also I'm not making, it's not becoming unsellable. And so I think like for me, it's just been a balancing act between how can I increase production so that I'm like selling, I'm keeping the quality where I want it, but I'm also selling more of an item so that I can definitely like, you know, make sure that I don't go bankrupt.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, you
Yeah.
know, so.
Yeah. What about you all? Do you have, like, how do you, when regional grains, we know that they are a lot of times more expensive. How does that translate to your menu and to your sales?
Well, I know I don't charge enough. But I say it's not just the grains. Like I've noticed butter is insane. Eggs, like it's painful. Like when I shop, it's like I need to raise my prices. Like
Yeah.
it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah, with a lot of the regional grains that I use that are more expensive, things like kamut, for example, or spelt, you know, if I bring a loaf to the table that has something like that in it, it's just not going to be 100% of that thing, because otherwise I'm going to have to charge through the roof for it. And kind of like I was talking about earlier, you can cut a loaf, you know, with white flour or with a different kind of whole grain flour and still get a lot of the wonderful flavor or texture that's unique to that grain. So when I make a kamut loaf, for example, I think it's about 30% of kamut, and the rest is white wheat that I get from Small Valley, which I guess when I said earlier, like, oh, Frankfurt Farms, you know, they do source all of my grains, but not everything I get is milled by them. They also source from Small Valley Milling, which is in Eastern PA. But yeah, making a loaf like that where it's more like 25-30% of those specialty grains, then I can still charge a higher price point for it, you know, explaining to customers, you know, well, what's kamut? And you give them the whole rundown. There's just much more balance there. And I've never heard someone complain to me that like, oh, well, this isn't 100% of that thing. Because you're still getting the unique experience, you're still getting the nutritional benefit of it. You're still getting something different and unique.
Would either of you say it's also beneficial for it to not be 100%? Because I've noticed that like there are some things that when I try to do it 100%, especially with bread, it just doesn't have the same outcomes because of the grain of the flour or whatnot, and it actually benefits from having that blend. So
I think so. I think it's really funny how you probably get this a lot, maybe not, but I feel like if someone's trying to buy something from me that has buckwheat in it, they're like, oh, I don't like buckwheat because I hate buckwheat pancakes, right? Because those are always like 100% buckwheat. And yeah, I don't know, I think that's gross. And I love buckwheat. Like, I just can't take that much buckwheat.
Right.
So no, I totally agree with you. Like, some grains really do benefit from being blended with other things. And I mean, especially in gluten-free baking, that's like the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think I ever even start with 100%. I'm always starting the other way.
Okay.
You know, like how much can I get to? But yeah.
Do you have a dream product that you can't source locally? That was Cassandra's question. And it can be grain, like hopefully it's grain, but if it's not, like.
Psyllium. If I could find somebody producing psyllium, I don't even know I don't know how that I would have to do a lot more research, but I know it's mostly produced in India. They just produce it in such large scale. If I could find a more local or even regional supplier of psyllium, or probably like sorghum, just because, and it not be something that is cross-contaminated, that would be really awesome.
A gluten-free sorghum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would probably say
I think it's emmer that I've been like trying to get my hands on. I was able to try using emmer, which is another kind of ancient grain wheat variety. And initially I did find it through Frankfurt Farms, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to sell it because the price point was so high. And so I only used it for experimentation or like demonstrating in workshops, that kind of thing. But I had dreamed of being able to use it in loaves that I could sell because I really did like the finished product. So
Yeah, a good answer. Because I can barely like use all the stuff that there's like, it's already more than I'm trying to like incorporate. But
Yeah.
I have recently started making these coconut rice cakes. They're like Filipino, and they have mochiko, the sweet rice flour. And it'd be cool if somebody locally did that.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably not,
Interesting. Well, let's do some rapid fire, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So we've got clipboards here. I guess I gotta carry this with me. So I'm gonna ask some common baking questions, or some like regional grain questions, and you're gonna write it down on the clipboard, and we're gonna flip them over at the same time.
should these be like one-word responses?
One-word responses,
so
short
hard.
responses, and not like an I don't know or an not sure.
So just whatever
So
our
we
answers.
want you to be on either side of the room. You gotta pick a side. Yeah.
Okay.
Ready? Okay. Yes or no? Can I substitute whole wheat flour for white flour? That looks like more than a yes or no.
Wait, I'm not done.
All right. So on the count of 3, you can flip them over. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
I should have written bigger.
Yes, and yes, maybe. Yes, sometimes. Okay. Oliver, can you elaborate, please?
Well, obviously you can't substitute whole wheat. You can't. I mean, if your options are whole wheat and white wheat, then yes. But also, when I think about that in terms of gluten-free baking, my version of whole wheat flour is a buckwheat blend that I make. So I just kind of substituted that in this question for myself, and I definitely think yes. And the maybe part of it comes from what you're making, because buckwheat tends to be higher fiber and tends to require more water, and it is a little bit more finicky in structure than like say brown rice or white rice or even sorghum. So it will require just more research and development. So.
That makes sense. Okay. With that paper, you can like take it off and just put it down. We're going to go to the next question. Salted or unsalted butter?
Oh, okay, no, I'm done.
All right. All right. Ready? Flip. Salted. Both. Okay. Erica, can you elaborate?
Depends what I'm using it for.
Okay.
I do, because like I can't make buttercream with salted butter. It's way too salty.
Yeah.
But I love salted butter in like my pie doughs and in my it's a brioche type dough that I use for my sticky buns. Yeah, so it does depend.
Thank you. All right. Next one. My cookies spread all over the pan. What did I do wrong? Okay, flip. Too much sugar or butter or baking soda. Too much fat, too hot of oven, not enough of something, and then more info needed. Yeah. Chloe, what would your first guess be?
Yeah, my first guess would be too much of something or not enough of something. Like probably ingredients-wise, something just like was skewed. Maybe you thought it said teaspoon, but it said tablespoon, or something to that effect.
But yeah, a lot of times like too much liquid in there, too much fat, or not enough flour, something to that effect. Yeah, yeah, just thinking about like the wet-dry ratio.
Thank you. All right. If you were a new baker wanting to dip your toes into regional grains, what product would you start with? And maybe to make it a little more harder, it can't be whole wheat flour.
So slightly different.
All right, flip. Whole wheat pastry flour or
I didn't even know
rye.
that existed. It is like one of my favorite.
Yeah,
It is really nice.
Yeah. Was that used in was that used in the workshop today?
Right? It's
Nice.
awesome.
With Frankfurt Farms pastry flour? Was it whole wheat?
It was whole wheat.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. And we have buckwheat. What's it say?
It says fancy or super fancy.
Fancy or super fancy, and then whole spelt.
Has a cape and everything.
That would be fun.
Chloe, what would you use whole spelt in if you were a new baker?
Yeah, I love whole spelt flour. It is a kind of whole wheat, I guess, so I sort of cheated. But it's just got such a nice, silky, smooth texture to it when it gets mixed in with whatever you're making, and has a sort of like, I don't know, nuttiness to it maybe that's different from regular whole wheat. And so I would say use it in anything that you would use whole wheat in. Just know that whenever you do make that substitution, whole spelt doesn't have as much of a sort of like structure to it. Like it's very extensible. So it kind of wants to just like, blah. So if you're doing bread, for example, just know that like your bread isn't going to want to hold its shape as much. It's going to want to kind of spread. So you could put it in pizza dough, for example, and it would be awesome. Or like focaccia or something that doesn't necessarily need that structure. But you could also put it in something that, that isn't going to necessarily depend on that upwards rise as much.
Do a lot of your customers who might have gluten sensitivities respond well to spelt?
Yeah, they also really like spelt for that reason. Yeah,
Yeah.
good point. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do one more.
Okay.
What is your favorite thing to bake?
Oh,
Gotta choose one. Should it have been what is your least favorite thing to bake?
Yeah,
least
probably.
favorite thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do least favorite.
Okay. Okay, so you can you can choose either or. Do you
Sorry,
wanna
I
flip
just
it? Do you have a least
took over
favorite one
this
in mind?
question. Yes.
Maybe more controversial would be fun.
Oh, this counts as baking, but
Ooh, yes.
you know, you'd think you'd have an answer because I swear I get that question all the time. Like, what's your favorite dessert? What's your favorite?
All right, ready, flip. Pies, cakes, and ice cream. Okay, can you, like, one sentence of why this is, wait, is this favorite, least favorite?
Favorite.
Favorite, and then,
Least favorite.
okay, so one sentence about
Is yours
why
cake?
it's, one favorite about, or one sentence
See, I
about
like
why it
making
is
both
your
those
least
things.
favorite or your most favorite. One sentence.
Probably because I like to eat it the most.
That makes sense.
Oh, I like to eat cake. But, but I hate working with sugar. I hate working with lots of sugar, and cakes just have no mental interest for me. Sorry, that was more than one sentence.
I have bad wrists, so it hurts to roll
Oh,
out.
yeah.
Sheeter.
That makes sense.
Yes.
All right, thank you for your answers. I'm going to open it up to everyone. What kind of questions do we have? Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is I think you
For the streaming audience.
Oh, okay. What's something you bake which you think you'll be baking forever? A product that you make, it's always going to be one of your items. And the second question is, how do you know how much to make every week when you go to the farmer's market? Are there going to be extras? What do you do with them? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
I guess I can start at this end.
Yeah.
So the first question is really interesting. I think right now it would probably be these sourdough rye brownies that I make. So it's whole rye, first of all, which nobody knows that it's whole grain, which is a good thing. You know, like people don't know it's healthy. But it's all fermented whole rye, and it's super, super fudgy, really decadent stuff. It keeps really well, so it's just like a really easy product to keep, you know, for various markets to make in large batches and freeze, or, you know, whatever you need to do to get it to the market. And as far as knowing how much to make, in the beginning it was just a lot of trial and error, and thankfully, you know, over the past years, I've kept a spreadsheet of my sales, and that kind of helps me year to year at least know, like, okay, you know, it's going to slow down in October probably, or, you know, oh, it's this holiday weekend. You know, last year you thought it was going to be really crazy busy, but it turns out no one actually cares about, you know, this holiday, whatever it is. So a lot of it is sort of like the catch-22 of like prior experience, but sometimes it is also just dependent on whether the weather's going to be good or not. So yeah, it just you just have to be prepared for anything, to be honest.
I would say probably our buckwheat sourdough bread. It tends to be the bread that people, apart from like something standard like the honey oat, which is like a sandwich bread, people wanted the most, and it tends to be like very popular. And also the buckwheat brownies. People like brownies. I just don't understand. Like, and I think those are two things that are reliably like asked for. In terms of the market, I feel like, you know, things have changed so much in the last couple of years, and I think, you know, I haven't done the market enough years as you have to be able to like see it like trending just yet, and also because I feel like with gluten-free, so many people are still getting to know us, and the fact that gluten-free things are possible, because there isn't a Saturday that goes by where someone comes up and they're like, what do you have that's gluten-free? Everything. Everything's gluten-free? And then it's like, kind of like a what? You know? And so it has made it interesting because people will come back but this year, for instance, we've sort of seen what kind of works in terms of volume. So I know that reliably I could sell about X pounds of buckwheat sourdough on a Saturday, or so many cookies, right? And then it's a lot of luck of the draw, because if sometimes the weather is terrible and people are like, nope, I'm not going out there. So you just kind of like have to really do all of this like sleuthing at the start of the week. Saturday is going to be nice. Okay, cool. Maybe people will come out. Maybe they won't. And with extra stuff, I think, you know, my friends really like me because I just give away a lot of bread when we have extra. And outside of that, you know, we eat it in the kitchen, and then what can be repurposed, we do. So that, you know, sometimes you can turn things into breadcrumbs, or sometimes like we can turn a cookie into a base for something. So it's just kind of figuring out where and what. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's really a shame with baking, because if you don't sell it, a lot of things you can't save, and it's heartbreaking. And we do try to donate it when we can. And but I'm going to also have to say brownies. I make a tahini brownie, and it's one of my best sellers, and it keeps really well. And if I don't sell it, I can actually refreeze it, which sounds terrible, but they freeze like beautifully. And
Yeah, no, we all do it.
I know.
Right.
There's no shame.
It's a dirty secret we don't talk about.
No one cares.
It's not a secret.
It's not a secret. Not anymore.
Yeah.
Other questions?
How do you interact with other bakers? Like, do you talk to your peers? Do you compare notes? How does that work?
Group chats.
Yeah, we're going to start that for sure.
Yeah, after this. When I was starting, I talked to Chloe a lot. You know, there are so many things that I didn't know. I had no idea how the markets worked, and I had no idea, you know, like, how much do you take to the market? You know, like, how, you know, while our products are different, you know, there are some things that I feel like I would not have had any clue And I think a lot of the uncertainty I had about doing something like a small baking business, you know, I always looked to Chloe sort of like as inspiration for what is possible. And so I feel like whether it's following folks on Instagram and like chatting via like direct messages or being like, hey, are you available for a thing? I know when I started, that was something that was so important for me. And then I don't know.
Well, I know, like, I've also called you to, like, when I was considering doing wholesale, like, you've gotten into wholesale in a real big way that, like, I just haven't been able to get myself in that mindset, or I don't know what, but that was really helpful, like, having conversations with Oliver about that kind of thing, even though, yeah, like you're saying, our products aren't one-to-one, but they're in a similar market, so, yeah.
Yeah, Chloe was also helpful when I did the market for the first time. Definitely. I would like to interact with more bakers in the city. I think I still feel like I haven't been able to kind of break into the food world as much as I'd like to in Pittsburgh. I would be totally open to that. Yeah. And I follow people like a weirdo on Instagram. No. I follow all the businesses.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, just what you were saying about, like, you know, meeting other bakers. Like, I think the bakers in Pittsburgh are fairly friendly, and, you know, like, it's not, like, competitive. There's enough to go around, I think. But, you know, I've met, like, a few other bakers from different, either bakeries or restaurants or whatever, who will mention it, and there's just, like, a lot of shared, I don't know what it is, like, just shared experiences. Yeah.
And I think one of the cool things for me, I recently hired someone who has been in the pastry industry for a while, and it is so nice to never have to make a cake. I'm like,
you hired well. There you go.
Can we make a cake? And obviously, like, all of the rest, because that person's background isn't gluten-free, so a lot of the recipe testing is things that I have to bring to the conversation, and then we like figure it out, but I don't have to frost anything. You know, and then this is not really your question, but I feel like most of the people that I talk to in the industry aren't so much bakers, but are farmers and restaurant, you know, owners or cafe people. And I feel like because a lot of the end game for our products, like, rely on these folks, you know, like, how can I source, you know, what can I source as locally as possible? And so, like, I've worked with Tacumba to get, like, you know, produce, or, you know, working with different folks. And I think, like, outside of the baking aspect of it, it's also just, like, really connecting with the whole food industry has been so helpful. Yeah.
This is partly a question, like, have you done this? And partly a suggestion, but so full disclosure, I wrote a book called Sourdough Culture, and in doing the research on sourdough, I came across and traded for a Russian rye sourdough from 1960 from an old Russian rye bread factory, and this is, the story that comes with it is informative for what your question was, which was the Soviet authorities said to the rye bread factory, you will turn out 1.5 million loaves every day, because the Soviet authorities didn't really care about who was buying it. And so they would send out 1.5 million loaves every day, and 500,000 would come back every day, that they then boiled up and put into, have you done it? So that's my question, right? So with rye especially, it's an exceptionally good way of making tomorrow's bread and dealing with waste. And then I'm sure you've also, and you live in Pittsburgh, which I don't, there must be some microbrew who's willing to take some of your breads to make the next batch, you know, to use that as a grain source for themselves. And so those are just, it's part question, part story. So.
I've never heard of this soup. Chloe, did you?
Oh, well, so the idea is to take leftover bread and, yeah, sort of break it apart, yeah, make it a mash, and then that goes into the next batch of bread, yeah, so that's...
Or we could make kvass.
Yes, or make kvass.
Kvass too, right, which you can also do, but it's exceptionally good.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
interesting.
so I've done it before in my home kitchen. I've not done it up to scale, and partially because I can't reliably have that leftover. That wouldn't be better sold as just fresh bread, right?
Partly what made me think of it was this, okay, what happens if almost every week you have 5 loaves left?
Right, yeah, but no, that's a great point that like a lot of things in a bakery can be recycled if you're creative enough.
Right, and I have come across the partnerships between brewers and bakers with trading stuff back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I personally probably don't have the highest volume for that, and again, like the reliability of having something to give. But I know that there are other bakers in Pittsburgh, like the people at Pigeon Bagel specifically will, they'll give their bagels to, I don't remember which brewery they work with, but yeah, they'll make like a special.
Or, I don't know if you've used spent grain.
I was just going to say, there's somebody that we know that just gave us samples. I don't know, I haven't tried mine yet.
Oh, it's amazing.
But using,
It's
yeah.
It's just like.
Oh, you're here?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I didn't see you. You were hiding. Oh, hey.
So you can speak about that.
You're totally.
There's something amazing about something that's been pre-cooked and soaked and mashed.
We're going to get to it.
Well, with rye in particular too, and yeah, I don't want to get off this point too much, but like with rye in particular, I feel like it does really well with time. Yeah, rye loaves, if you're doing 100% rye, which I will say, as far as using 100% of something, like 100% rye, if you can hit it right, is just so good. And I used to make a loaf that was 100% rye, and as of the last year, I don't know if it was something about the way that I was doing the recipe or if it had something to do with the grain, but I just have not been able to get it right. So I had to take it off my menu, unfortunately. But yeah, like that is a grain in particular, I think that like not only requires the time to set and to like have that flavor develop, but does improve. Yeah.
Well, we are out of time, but good news. We have a happy hour at 4 that you can continue asking these questions from 4 to 6. One last question for me. Can you talk about where we can find you and any cool projects coming up?
Yeah, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, let's talk about So I'm at the Bloomfield Market, first of all, every Saturday up until Thanksgiving, and I'm planning to also teach workshops over the winter, so I'm not going to be doing the markets probably over the winter, like not selling my wares. But if you want to learn more about how to bake bread or with local grains, something to that effect, you should check out my website. Just Google Crustworthy and it should come up. But I'm really looking forward to working on this new project with Erica, also with a couple of others, Beth Taylor, Benjamin Bishop. We're all in the talks of creating a sort of bakery cooperative. So that would be a new business entirely that we're all bringing our own expertise to. We're really, really excited about it, and we have no deadlines or dates on anything, so don't ask us about that. We don't have a storefront. It's still very much in the beginning stages, but I think there's a lot of potential there to bring something really, really new.
Yeah.
And I want you to be able to say stuff about it too, but yeah.
Oh, me? Oh, yeah. No, I'm super excited. We're just learning all the ropes. We're working. It's the KDC they're working with. So we're going through this whole program. They're going to walk us through step by step so that we'll have hopefully bylaws and a business, financial plan, because it's kind of all new to us. And it's awesome. Like I'm really actually more into learning all the stuff than I am into like baking right now. Yeah, but you can. I'll probably move to. I'm done with my markets, and I'll probably move to online ordering. And I'll probably do like Thanksgiving pies, and I'll do a bunch of stuff for Christmas. And I can go order through my website. It's labogato.com. Cool. Yep.
Yeah, we're at the Bloomfield Market through the end of the summer season. I'm probably not going to do the winter markets just because I wasn't raised to be frozen.
Because they're terrible. They're terrible. Sorry.
Yeah, it's really difficult to be outside.
I love the idea
Can
of
we
it.
find you anywhere else?
Yeah, so if you check our website, wildrisebakery.com, there's like a find us section where you can, and one of the things that we are working on is just expanding our wholesale offering. So like right now, there are several like cafes and restaurants that carry our products, and you can find us reliably every week through Harvey. They carry our products.
Is Harvey here too? Oh,
Hey,
cool.
cool. The Eastern Food Co-op carries our bread and brownies and pies, and then like there are other just places that you can pick us up.
Well, thank you all. Round of applause for the bakers. Great job. Thank you for all of the information that you shared today. If you all stick around, the next thing on the schedule is the happy hour at 4. So we'll see you at the bread oven. Yeah.
We're just